since Megna has been so gracious and already introduced the panel, one of the panelists that was supposed to be here, unfortunately couldn't make it, so that gives us a little extra time to stretch out if you need to, to finish your thoughts. And if you guys don't mind, since I'm standing first, do you mind if I go first? Thank you. The name of my contribution is Fidel Castro's Revolutionary Propaganda, Targeting the Cuban People. And before I start that, I would just like to read a quote by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And it says, quote, "As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free." And I want you to hold on to that thought. I want to begin with a working definition of the word propaganda. Ideas, facts, or allegations spread deliberately to further one's cause or to damage an opposing cause. Also, a public action having such an effect. I chose this particular topic in an attempt to answer just two questions. One, is there a similarity between pre-revolutionary Cuba and the United States currently? And two, how did this small group of revolutionaries defeat a well-equipped army of 30,000 soldiers with unchecked power over the Cuban citizenry? I believe one is the ability of the revolutionaries to organize and the use of propaganda and political warfare. The propaganda campaign that Fidel Castro and his followers waged set the conditions in Cuba and internationally. Why do I say that? The campaign helped the revolutionaries gain Cuban society's favor and prevented an international, specifically an American, reaction to the insurrection and ultimately led to the revolutionaries' victory. The Cuban Revolution's propaganda and political warfare tactics, when studied, or I like the term reverse engineered, in its original context will illustrate a well-planned and executed psychological operation that influenced numerous targeted audiences and led to behavioral changes that helped Castro seize power while commanding a numerical and technologically inferior force. Therefore, my focus is on the people of Cuba and not the international campaign. The allotted time would not be enough to cover both the local and international campaigns. One could speak for hours on just a single targeted audience and come up with more questions as you seek answers. Hopefully, the subject of the Cuban Revolution will become an ongoing study and discussion to gain clarity moving forward. Let me begin that I believe that Fidel Castro understood clearly the importance of uniting all revolutionary movements throughout the island. Let me give you a brief review. On November 5th, 1956, 82 Cuban revolutionaries based in Mexico boarded a broken down yacht named La Granma and headed for Cuba. 7 days later, the yacht ran aground near Los Colorados Beach in Cuba's Oriente province. The landing was well south of the intended site where 50 supporters were waiting. 3 days later, government soldiers, reportedly tipped off by a local peasant, surrounded the revolutionists and almost annihilated them. 12 to 20 revolutionists survived and escaped to the Sierra Madre Mountains to continue their fight against Cuban dictator and strongman Fulgencio Batista. 24 months later, the survivors had formed the nucleus of a rebel army that marched to Havana to form a revolutionary government that continues to shape international relations in the Western Hemisphere. Similar to the historical experience of Black Americans, race relations in Cuba were based on the legacy of slavery as an institution. Blacks and mulattoes played significant roles in the wars for Cuban independence from Spain in 1868 through 1878, and later in 1895 through 1898. Quote, racism and repression institutionalized, unquote. The United States intervened in 1898, robbing the Cubans of what would have been a military victory over their Spanish occupiers. U.S. authorities disbanded the Liberation Army and replaced them with the Havana Police and Rural Guard. Both of these organizations were strictly white in composition. In the ensuing years, Cuban homegrown racism would be nurtured, refined, and quote unquote improved by the strong U.S. presence on the island. Some examples. In 1910, a law was passed that prohibited the organization of political parties along racial lines, which was in response to the Colored Independence Party that was organized in 1908 among demobilized black liberation fighters. Jose Miguel Gomez was in power. A race war known as Little War of 1912 took place, which the Cuban community never fully recovered from its defeat. This laid the basis that enabled Cuban capitalists to establish an insidious pattern of job discrimination against blacks that lasted up to the 1959 revolution. Quote unquote Jim Crow, racism, enforced through unwritten laws, restricted blacks to specific beaches, parks, walkthroughs, neighborhoods, and schools. Needless to say, black political representation was affected. Blacks, mulattoes, and poor whites were effectively excluded from a decent education through underfunding of public schools and the proliferation of private schools that catered to the educational needs of the rich. In Havana, upper-class social clubs excluded blacks as a matter of policy. A brutally repressive police apparatus was always standing by to make sure that the victims of racism were never permitted to organize protests against institutionalized inequality. In my opinion, it would be safe to assume that the blacks, mulattoes, and poor whites were revolutionized by the state, making Fidel's work a little easier to ensure their participation in the revolution. Also, as a side note, a study by sociologist Maurice Zeitlin of industrial workers in Cuba in 1962 illustrates how quickly black working people embraced the revolution. He found that 80% of black industrial workers expressed enthusiastic support for the revolution versus 67% of white industrial workers. Objective 1, convince the Cubans of the revolution's legitimacy. Target audiences, the Santiago De Cubans, the Guajiros, the Cuban youth movements, and the Cuban military. Question, who are the people that make up the target audiences? The Santiago de Cubans, or Santiagueros, were proud, defiant, and anti-government in general. Santiago de Cuba, located on the eastern end of Cuba near the Sierra Maestra Mountains in the Oriente province, is, quote, shut off from Havana as surely as if it were another country, unquote. It is a port city and has long been the second most important after Havana and second largest. It is the home of Frank País. Frank País Pasquera was a Cuban revolutionary who campaigned for the overthrow of Batista's government in Cuba. País was the urban coordinator of the 26th of July movement and was a key organizer within the urban underground movement, collaborating with Fidel Castro's revolutionary force, which conducted activities in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. The urban underground movement against Batista was everywhere, but nowhere was it stronger than in Santiago de Cuba, País' home. País organized students and young working people. País asked each person to organize a cell to prepare a list of friends and close associates, people they could trust. Both blacks and whites were selected. The average age was 17. They prepared carefully, finding, repairing, and hiding weapons, participating in mass demonstrations against the dictatorship, raising money, collecting medical supplies. They published a mimeograph bulletin which sold for 10 cents, reporting the news and criticizing the government, countering the censorship with which Batista periodically blanketed the island. The Guajiros. The Sierra was sparsely inhabited by 60,000 or so of the hard-scrabble farmers called Guajiros, the poor, illiterate black, white, and mulatto peasants whose beaten-up straw hats, gnarled bare feet, and unintelligible, devout, rapid-fire Spanish vernacular had made them the favorite butt of derogatory jokes among Cuba's urban middle class. To be called a Guajiro was to be called stupid, a half-witted hillbilly. Some of the Guajiros were tenant farmers, but many were also illegal squatters or picarazistas who built their own dirt floor huts, cleared a patch of land, and eked out a subsistence living as farmers, honey collectors, or charcoal burners. The Sierra had little gainful employment for farmers or markets, virtually no roads or schools, and practically no modern amenities. The starkness of the lives of the Sierra Maestra Guajiros contrasted sharply with those of its landowners, and for that matter, with most of the people living in the Oriente provinces, towns, and cities. The situation of the peasants in the rugged mountain zones was nothing less than frightful. The peasants, having migrated from afar with a yearning for freedom, had put all his efforts into squeezing out an existence from the newly cleared land. Through 1,001 sacrifices, he had coaxed the coffee plants to grow on the craggy slopes of the mountain. All this he did by his own sweat, responding to the age-old yearning of a man to possess his own plot of land, which he treated as part of his very self. Suddenly, when the coffee plants were beginning to blossom with the fruit that represented his hope, the lands were reclaimed by a new owner. It might be a foreign company, a local land grabber, or some other speculator taking advantage of peasants' indebtedness. The political bosses and local army chieftains worked for the company or the land grabbers, jailing or murdering any peasant who was unduly rebellious against the arbitrary acts. For the second time, Cuba experienced the most criminal page of its history, resettlement. The first to order it was Weyler, the bloody general of colonial Spain. General Valeriano Weyler was Spain's governor of Cuba in 1896 during the Independence War. He ordered the forced resettlement of much of the rural population in concentration camp-type conditions. Now it was being ordered by Batista, the worst traitor and assassin known to Latin America. Hunger, misery, illness, epidemics, and death decimated the peasants resettled by the tyranny. Children died for lack of medical attention and food. When a few steps away, the resources existed that could have saved their lives. The indignant protests of the Cuban people, international scandal, and the dictatorship's inability to defeat the rebels compelled the tyrants to suspend the resettlement of peasant families from the Sierra Maestra. The peasants returned with an unbreakable will to struggle unto death or victory, as rebels unto death or freedom. Castro understood that to survive in the Sierras, he needed the Guajiros' support. He had to convince them to support the 26th of July movement, to recruit them to join the revolution, and to persuade them to inform on government actions in the area. Here's a quote by Ernesto Che Guevara. Revolution rarely, if ever, emerge fully ripe, and not all their details are scientifically foreseen. They are products of passion, of improvisation by human beings in their struggle for social change, and are never perfect. Our revolution was no exception. Ernesto Che Guevara was born in Argentina on June 14, 1928. Both before and after graduating from medical school in 1953, he traveled extensively through the Americas. While living in Guatemala in 1954, he became involved in political struggle, opposing the CIA's eventual successful attempt to overthrow the government of Jacobo Arbenz. Following the ouster of Arbenz, he escaped to Mexico. There, in the summer of 1955, he was selected by Fidel Castro as the third confirmed member of an expeditionary force being organized by the Cuban July 26 movement to overthrow dictator Fulgencio Batista. Originally, the troop doctor, Guevara was named commander of the 2nd Rebel Army column number 4, in July 1957. Guevara served to motivate the Guajeros. In late 1957, with Castro's permission, Guevara began to build a small-scale infrastructure in his sector of the Sierra Maestra. Guevara's action demonstrated to the local population the rebels' commitment to improving their lives. Guevara oversaw the construction of a small hospital, a bread oven, pig and poultry farms, a cigar factory, and a small armory. The guerrillas paid farmers to grow certain types of vegetables so the rebels could purchase them for subsistence. The benefit of seeing words transform into action served to steel the resolve of the Guajeros to support the rebels. Guevara also established a newspaper and radio network to serve the area. The small newspaper, El Cubano Libre, was copied on a mimeograph and distributed throughout the area. Articles written by Castro, Guevara, and others served to illustrate the ideology of the 26th of July movement and their plans for Cuba's future. The radio station started small, broadcasting only in the local area, but widening its area as the war progressed. Quote from Guevara, "When we began to broadcast from our own transmitter, the existence of our troops and their fighting determination became known throughout the Republic. Our links began to become more extensive and complicated, even reaching Havana and Camagüey in the west, where we had important supply centers, and Santiago in the east. The results of the intensive campaign waged among the Guajeros served the rebels well. The network of supporters kept the rebels informed of the presence of not only the army, but any strangers who entered the rebel zone. The combination of civil and military development provided a working model of the society the revolution hoped to create. The Batistas also targeted the Guajeros, but the strength of Castro's campaign prevented government inroads into rebel zones. Castro, able to give the Guajeros hope, and the Guajeros gave Castro time and support he needed for success. Next, the Cuban youth movement, another key group that Castro targeted. Castro's objective were to establish the legitimacy of the 26th of July movement, to unite all revolutionary efforts, and to convince youth movements that the main effort was in the Sierra Maestra Mountains. On the 23rd of July, 1953, Castro released a manifesto declaring the philosophy of the revolution to the Cuban people. The manifesto defined the vanguard of the revolution as, quote, youth that wanted a new Cuba, a youth that has freed itself from all the faults, the mean ambitions, and the sins of the past, unquote. Student riots and anti-Batista protests became the norm due to high unemployment rates, especially among college students. Batista's forces dealt with the protests through repressive actions. Torture and murder took place in inner cities of suspected revolutionaries. In September 1956, Fidel Castro and Jose Antonio Echeverria, the leader of the University Federation of Students, signed a pact known as the Mexico Pact that united the revolutionary efforts of these two powerful organizations. Estudiante, or DRE, a militant organization that played an important role in the Cuban Revolution. The DR, as it came to be called, formed the nucleus of the urban guerrillas in Havana. The pact, titled Letter from Mexico, affirmed that M-26-7 and the FEU's DR had joined forces to overthrow the Batista regime through revolutionary force, and called on all students, workers, and, quote, worthy Cubans, unquote, to join armed struggle, which would end only by victory or death. The document also called for, upon victory, embracing programs of social justice, liberty, and democracy, and the avoidance of hate and vindictiveness towards anyone. Echeverria and his colleague took over the national radio station of Cuba on March 13, 1957, at the time of a music program which most of the Cuban people usually listened to, so that Echeverria's anti-Batista 3-minute speech would be broadcast to the whole Cuban nation. Thus, on the eve of Castro's invasion, unity with a powerful youth organization took shape and legitimized the 26th of July movement in the eyes of other youth movements throughout Cuba. And finally, the Cuban military. Castro knew that if he could influence the Cuban military to support the revolution by either joining him or at least not fighting him, he could rapidly achieve Batista's overthrow. The objective he established to influence the military or to erode military support for Batista stressed the legitimacy of the 26th of July movement and emphasized the inevitability of the military's defeat. To overcome the censorship barrier and embarrass the Batista administration, Castro sent a messenger to Havana to invite a foreign journalist to meet him in the Sierra Maestra Mountains of eastern Cuba. The journalist picked was Herbert Matthews of the New York Times. In 3 articles resulting from his brief encounter with Castro, Matthews gave an almost heroic impression of the Cuban revolutionary, describing him as, quote, the flaming symbol of the opposition to the regime, unquote, and boldly predicted that, quote, from the looks of things, General Batista cannot possibly hope to suppress the Castro revolt, unquote. A judgment made at the time when the insurgent band consisted only of 18 poorly armed, half-starved men on the run. A political bombshell, the Times article, with their photographic evidence of the historic meeting, gave a lie to Batista's insistence that Castro was dead, overstated the strength of the insurgent band thanks to Castro's deliberate effort to deceive Matthews, and gave the insurgents vital international exposure. Castro's comrade in arms, Che Guevara, recalled 2 years later, quote, at the time, the presence of a foreign journalist, preferably an American, was more important to us than a military victory, unquote. Within a month of the Matthews interview, the band of 18 had grown to about 80. For his support, Matthews was later decorated by Castro. The intermediaries who had arranged the Matthews trip later set up a similar propaganda exercise with the Columbia Broadcasting System. The resulting television documentary, which included a dramatic interview with Castro atop the highest mountain peak in Cuba, further enhanced the rebels' romantic image. In June 1957, Batista began an all-out offensive against Castro that led to Castro being surrounded on a mountain crest near La Plata. With no more than 40 men, they held their position, wearing down the attackers. Castro used this opportunity to apply tactical psychological warfare for the first time in the Sierra War by installing loudspeakers that blared the national anthem, patriotic songs, and revolutionary exhortations at the exhausted Batista soldiers. Castro's forces denied the military victory at that decisive point. Castro also opened a dialogue with military commanders, and several exchanges illustrate his PSYOP's objective of eroding support to the regime. General Elogio Cantillo, he wrote, "I appreciate your noble feeling toward us. We are, after all, your compatriots, not your enemies, because we are not at war with the armed forces, but against the dictator." During the Battle of Mompe, Castro fought against a former law student colleague, Major Jose Quevedo. Castro reportedly held a dialogue with Quevedo guaranteeing the good treatment of the soldiers if they surrendered. After several days of this, Quevedo surrendered. The rebels fed Quevedo's soldiers before turning them over to the International Red Cross. Castro's campaign against Cuban armed forces was effective and greatly hastened his march to victory. Lessons learned. Examining Castro's propaganda effort is valuable for PSYOPs specialists because it illustrates the effectiveness of a well-planned, flexible plan. The most important aspect of the effort was never losing sight of the mission, in this case, the overthrow of the Batista regime. Propaganda can take on a life of its own, but Castro was able to direct his program to support his objectives at all times. Incidentally, the program Castro successfully executed parallels current US PSYOPs doctrine, illustrating the soundness of the principles. Finally, in my opinion, it demonstrates the importance of organizing, growing a movement, and being accountable to the people. And I'd like to close as I open with the quote, "As long as the mind is enslaved, the body can never be free."
So today I'm going to talk about the importance of Fidel Castro and the Cuban Revolution to youth. Not just youth in Cuba, but to youth here today. Because we should take lessons from the Cuban Revolution and put them into practice. So just starting off with a short story. And by the way, if I say something that I posted on the Facebook status, don't call me out for it. I like to think out loud, so yeah. So since I myself am young, and most of my experiences organizing have been with young people, today I will be addressing the importance of the Cuban Revolution to youth, while examining some challenges that I see in our movement in hopes to bring some clarity to our situation. Please understand, however, that our analysis does not exist only within this space. We must practice, we must be vulnerable and brave. In order to address these challenges and come to a conclusion that will be vital to our movement, there must be a confrontation of our reality. We can look to the Cuban Revolution not to solve all of our issues, but as a model or a foundation to build on in our continuous struggle to get free. There is a false idea or a notion that revolution consists only of a violent clash, and that the ones with the quote-unquote better intentions or morals triumphs, and they're called the revolutionaries. Then suddenly, all the backwardness caused by the hundreds of years of colonial occupation reverses itself, smoothly making the transition into socialism. But there's nothing romantic about this struggle. It requires our capacity to love and be courageous during tough moments that go against what we've internalized for all our lives. Most importantly, revolution is not a magical process. It is a human process. With that being said, I believe that 1959 was in fact only the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. The Cuban Revolution raised as many questions about how we organize and struggle today as it gave solutions or answers. And I want to pose some of those questions today. I'm going to start by discussing the Cuban literacy program campaign. Youth today are in a state of crisis, and it's not their fault. They are humiliated and infantilized. They are told that they are lazy. They are told that they are troublemakers and responsible for all the ills of society. Working class youth especially bear the brunt of this, as they are labeled as people who are responsible for the backwardness of society today. During their youth, Cuban children, or children in Cuba, are taught early on about the Vietnamese General Vo Nguyen Giap's concept of the People's War. It is the idea that we are responsible for something that is much greater than us, that we are accountable not only to our communities or to our country, but to the world, and that we must defend the freedom of the motherland at all costs, as we are all participants in this revolutionary struggle for freedom and independence. In the Cuban literacy program campaign, there was a call mostly to youth, and not just any youth, but especially young women, to go into the countryside in Cuba and teach people, even grown men, how to read. The Cuban literacy program succeeded in eradicating illiteracy. Youth were a determining factor in this success. However, the brilliance of this campaign did not only lie in the focus on youth. The campaign highlighted collective struggle, that in spite of our identities or our age or our class or what we were in our past life, and I mean that by saying before the revolution, before seizing power, we can overcome these things to build the country and the world together as one. The campaign also raises the question, what does it look like to have an education that's not only for the people, but by the people? To have a hand on our future and to write our own history. What does it mean to have autonomy over our schools and what they teach us? When we open up a book and read, we are essentially entering a new world. We are able to travel in spite of our physical limitations. If youth had this power in America, what would that look like? What happens when the capitalist tables are turned and the ones labeled as degenerates are now a part of, as Che puts it, the motor of a revolution? What happens when the wretched of the earth lead themselves to self-determination and collectively turn a blade towards the throat of the settler? What does it mean to have an education that is in our interests and helps us process the world? What does this mean to kids in our city whose lives that are made out to be without purpose or without any duty to humanity? Schools that are engineered by the state to serve the ruling class and to make us become betrayers of our own people. Schools that are simply preparing our children for prison. What happens when the power is in our hands? Fidel knew that reading and writing was the first step for Cubans to understand their reality, and that struggle and education can't be separated, and action without education is useless. Next is on the need for a Cuban revolution. I kind of wrote these out like Mao Zedong, like on. Yeah. On the need for cultural revolution. Over the course of the past few years, a new form of art has emerged, aimed directly at youth. It stems from the crocodile tears of the ruling class, along with an insidious motive to co-opt social movements and manipulate minds of the masses, especially poor people, the most vulnerable to this violence. It is accompanied by seemingly radical imagery of the heroes of our people, Malcolm, Martin. It celebrates identity and not our spirit. It is appealing in aesthetics, but hollow in substance. These so-called revolutionary images or caricatures will be put together with messages in the forms of lyrics or messages through script writing that encourages individualism. People are used as props. There is no emphasis on the soul of humanity, but the artificial and the superficiality. There is no emphasis on united movement, but individual success, which perpetuates the lie of the self-made man in capitalist society. This is how art and culture in the hands of the elite can also be a weapon of ideological violence against poor people, as it furthers the illusion of the American dream.
Go ahead.
We are understandably excited as youth of color that we are finally getting representation in corporate-controlled media. But it all comes with a price. It is hard even among the left to deny its catchiness. Excited over this representation, we become blinded and fall into the trap. We become self-righteous. We look at ourselves as superior. There are other ways in which art in mainstream America can serve neo-colonial power and is instrumental in counter-revolution as well. I'll give you a few examples. The apartheid state of Israel boasts its richness in land and material wealth. Major artists come through and perform in Israel all the time. And Israel uses this clean, utopian, decadent images to mask the genocide of the indigenous Palestinian people who lived on that land first. Another example, Temple University openly promotes their token rapping professor in its corrupt AFAM department to attract more students, thus furthering the gentrification and displacement of working class black and brown people in North Philadelphia. Today we are seeing more black and brown faces on TV, while more black and brown people across the world are getting bombed and displaced. At whose expense is this happening, the representation? And is the feel-goodness of finally getting representation good enough to overlook these issues? We must be the writers of our own history. There is a notion that Cuba, under socialism, has a lack of culture, that they're repressive, they don't let this, that, and the third type of music, and that you could be arrested for playing, a certain type of music. That there's a lack of culture. But the Cuban Revolution proved that the opposite is true. Fidel focused greatly on the arts, whether dance, music, or sports. The Cuban Revolution resulted in an emphasis of culture. Art is used as a pedagogy that speaks not only to the pain and suffering of a civilization, but also to their resilience in the face of calamity. It is the emphasis of life, humanity, and Earth itself, which are not separate. All the things that form culture. And for my boxing fans, the Cubans have also excelled in that field as well. Let us draw upon this model, because there is no revolution without a culture that represents the spirit of humanity. The question is, how do we tap into an already existing culture of resilience that we already have? One that is accountable to the people, that gives messages of collectivity and solidarity and brings that to the forefront. Let's also find a way to unpack and unlearn these politics of identity and realize that our enemies no longer only have white faces. Some of our enemies even look just like us. On leadership. So I'm going to tell a short story about Fidel. So after the attack on the Moncada barracks, the failed attack when he was captured, and he was held captive by one of Batista's guards, Fidel, in his boldness and his ridiculous audacity, actually revealed to the guard that he was himself Fidel Castro, because they couldn't recognize him, because they had been, I believe, in the mountains for so long that his beard grew out and you couldn't recognize him. So Fidel, in his boldness, actually told that guard that he was who he was. And that guard actually ended up saving his life. It was when another guard his name was Lieutenant Chalmont, who was actually known as the mass torturer, and the killer in Batista's army. And when Lieutenant Chalmont told the guard that captured Fidel to hand him over, he said, no, he's coming with me. And I tell this story because Fidel actually, after 1959, when he seized power, he actually, that same guard that saved his life, he promoted him to captain in his army. And I tell this story to address this fatalistic way of viewing the world among the left that stems from capitalism and what I just addressed on culture. Fidel could have easily fulfilled a feeling of bloodlust and revenge by killing that man once he seized power. But he did not take that opportunity because that's not what revolution, or, as Che puts it, if you're revolutionary, you love humanity. That's not what this is about. In college organizing, and I'm speaking from my experience, our challenge is developing a politics that reflects the values of the people and not of the institution. Yeah. The left has betrayed the very people that they claim to be out here fighting for. It is this fatalism that infests the minds of many youth in our movement today, and it is best exemplified in call-out culture. It is rooted in a belief that human beings are not capable of change or overcoming being steered in the wrong direction by the system, that a backward society cannot be turned around. The people who bear the brunt of these attacks, these call-outs, are mostly ones who do not have access to academia. What this attitude does is also take the focus away from our collective material conditions that we all share, whether it's one of poverty, being a victim of state violence, or other forms of oppression that don't have anything to do with our identity, but more so our class and things like that. But because you could do this, that, and the third, but at the same time, you could all be poor and exploited in spite of your identity. So what this identity politics and fatalism does is that it negates that common ground that can be found in organizing with people and that unity. Most importantly, we do not get to pick and choose who deserves to be liberated. Yeah. A true revolutionary believes in the people. Yeah. If this fatalist attitude will lead to our progression, then by that logic, we must denounce Malcolm X, who went from a petty street hustler called Detroit Red to a leading member of the Nation of Islam. We should also denounce Fidel and Che for their European blood and light skin. Capitalism not only affects, I messed up there, but capitalism also ingrains a superiority complex with us, no matter what color we are. We must keep in mind that our motive is not to replicate the power of our oppressors, but to seize that power, change it, and distribute it evenly. Solidarity is often something that is romanticized. It's made out to be, this joining of two struggles coming in the form of like public statements, like, people who just become politicized often like cite, the Black Panthers having a statement of solidarity with the George Bush and the PFLP. But that's not all that solidarity is. It's a shared common struggle. And before we do anything else, we must build solidarity amongst ourselves. To do this, we must be willing to struggle with each other. This is why a fatalist mentality is a dead end in building a movement. It works against collective unity and does the work that the Democratic Party and the system in its entirety is attempting to do now for them. It plays into the hands of the enemy. Institutions, organizations that carry themselves as such function as an extension of the state serving the agenda of the ruling class. If we are looking to call people out, shut it down, or destroy, then we have already learned how to do those things from the very best. However, if we want to find new ways to love, build, and move spirits, then we must confront how American anti-intellectualism and individualism is holding us back from achieving collective solidarity. We must look to the Cuban Revolution as a model. This will require creativity on our behalf. Che said that we must create many Vietnams. But in the same light, to create many Vietnams, we must create many Fidels and Che's. And this is a quote from Fidel that is a good explanation of what this means. When in Cuba, we speak of the new man. We are speaking about a radically different type of man than the one formed and educated in a capitalist society. A man that feels the importance of the collective, a new man with a communist awareness. A man that understands that the wealth that man creates is meant to satisfy the needs of society as a whole, that he who needs more should receive more, he who needs less should receive less. And just to add on to leadership and also like political education, Hugo Chavez, even in his last days, was confident that the people of Venezuela could carry on the revolution themselves. Because of the political education, because of the Bolivarian circles, he was preparing his people for that long-term struggle, and that's what we need to bring into our organizing as well. So this raises the question of leadership in our organizations. Building a movement that doesn't depend solely on one person, that everyone is ideologically equipped to take the place of the leader if need be. So in conclusion, the capitalist model of leadership, education, and culture has only misled the people to work against this idea of the people's war. There is sufficient evidence, only some of which I mentioned above, that we are not yet prepared for long-term struggle. But let this not discourage us. If the process that we've made has been relatively small in terms of our liberation, then imagine all the possibilities of tomorrow. Dr. Montero, my mentor, often brings up this idea or concept of the beautiful people. The beautiful people are the ones who live in major cities on the West and East Coast, the ones with houses with white picket fences and who have access to the decadent illusion of the American dream. I would like to extend this idea that the opposite of the beautiful people are the ones whose lives do not match the decadent illusion of the American dream. The ones humiliated and made to feel stupid by SAT scores as if that defines their self-worth, the unemployed, poor people, the children who grew up in single-parent households, the people in society who are made to feel unworthy of love. Finally, we must ask ourselves this question: who is the left? The people do not need a left that remains in their ivory towers while using the working class, poor, rejected people of this society as an aesthetic to their hollow and empty revolutionary facades. The people need a political ideology that prioritizes the needs of the poor and working class and works in their benefit. This will separate the opportunists from the revolutionaries.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone. I would like to thank the organizing committee, Dr. Montero, and the Saturday School for inviting me to make a presentation tonight. So, my consciousness about the Cuban Revolution is a result of my 30-some years of activism in the All-African People's Revolutionary Party and Kwame Toure's involvement in that organization, and also now in the Saturday School. I want to start by talking a little bit about Fidel Castro and he spoke about the significance of the Congress and re-emphasized Cuba's unwavering support for Angola and all of Africa. It was during this speech that Comandante Fidel Castro declared that Cuba is not only a Latin American nation, but also a Latin African nation. He said, and I quote, "African blood flows freely through our veins. many of our ancestors came as slaves from Africa to this land. As slaves, they struggled quite a great deal. They fought as members of the Liberating Army of Cuba. We are brothers and sisters of the people of Africa, and we are ready to fight on their behalf. And there was a rousing applause. So this statement by Fidel Castro is important to give background to some of the thinking and the ideological thinking behind Cuba's huge contribution to Africa, in addition to its revolutionary internationalism and solidarity. And this tremendous Pan-African contribution by Cuba, not only to African national liberation movements fighting colonialism, but to the quality of life in Africa in general, up to the present day, I might add. So this makes Fidel Castro not only a revolutionary internationalist, but a revolutionary Pan-Africanist. And a lot of people would question, some of these people would question that, but for us, ideology trumps biology every time, like Brandon has just said. So therefore, Fidel Castro is also a revolutionary Pan-Africanist. Cuba's contribution to Africa and her people has been extraordinary and extensive and unparalleled. No nation has been more generous. I'm just presenting a few of the examples here tonight. So on January 1st, 1959, Cuba's victory in the of the revolution happened. Only 6 months after that, I heard tonight that Che went to India, but Che went to Egypt in June of 1959 already, and he met with the great Gamal Abdel Nasser in June of 1956. This was very important because Gamal Abdel Nasser had just overthrown a reactionary king, and he was a strong anti-imperialist and supported anti-colonial movements as well in Africa. So this meeting with Che and Gamal Abdel Nasser was very key. He also, while there, he met the FLN, which was Algeria's anti-colonial independence movement. Algeria was fighting the ruthless colonialism of the French at the time. So I just want to show how early this bond already happened with Cuba. Even before Cuba declared socialism, their solidarity was there. They understood the need for international solidarity to protect their own revolution and to encourage revolutions around the world. So right after Che went, the very next year in 1960, Raul Castro followed with a trip to Egypt as well to make cordial relations with progressive countries and revolutionary countries in Africa at the time, like Guinea and Ghana. In April 1961, Cuba was attacked by Yankee imperialism and Castro and Cuban counter-revolutionary exiles at the Bay of Pigs, Playa Girón. It is important to note this because the heroic defense of the Cuban people of their revolution and homeland was tested and required significant human resources and material. In spite of that, only 8 months after Girón, or Bay of Pigs, in January 1962, Cuba delivered after it was requested by the Algerians requested arms to fight the French. They had people, but they didn't have enough arms. So Cuba sent a shipment of military aid to Algeria in January 1962 of weapons to the FLN. So this ship, once it unloaded all the weapons in Algeria, it returned to Cuba with 76 wounded Algerians and 20 Algerian orphan children. just to show you this solidarity. So Algeria gained its independence in 1962, July, and elected the great Pan-Africanist revolutionary Ahmed Ben Bella. Ahmed Ben Bella visited Cuba in October 1962 and met with Comandante Fidel Castro. He also met with the Algerians who the boat had returned with and the children, receiving training and education in Cuba. He also requested at that time medical assistance from the Cubans in Algeria because once Algeria gained independence, all the French doctors left. And so it left Algeria with very few, if any, doctors there. So Cuba at that point was only, in 62, so they didn't have that many doctors trained yet, but Cuba sent its first medical brigade to Africa in 1962 after Ben Bella asked Fidel Castro, and they sent 50 doctors and nurses to Algeria. So the next little story, this is also related to Algeria, which is a story I really like, is in 1963, Morocco, who was supported by the United States, had expansionist ideas. So they attacked and captured a border town of Algeria and took some of Algeria's land. So Ahmed Ben Bella said, no, we can't have this. So they challenged it, they started fighting, and it started what they called the War of the Desert. So, but Morocco's forces far outshined Algeria's forces. They were stronger, they had better weapons from the US, and they were just stronger. So Algerians weren't doing so well in defending their country. So what did Ben Bella do? He picked up the phone and called Fidel. He said, Fidel, I need some fighters here because we can't fight these people off and we're not giving them any parts of our land. So Fidel then had, thought about it, and quickly they assembled a ship of combatants, military hardware, artillery, tanks, and doctors as well, to go to Algeria. So they went to Algeria, and mind you, this was a huge sacrifice in 1962 because Cuba had an economic contract with Morocco to sell sugar. So they knew if they sent this ship that economic contract about the sugar would be canceled for sure because, that was Morocco. And also, right at that time, Cuba was hit with a devastating hurricane that killed 1,400 people. In spite of all of that, Cuba's ship arrived in broad daylight in Algeria. And it was supposed to arrive at night, being real discreet, But because of the weather, the ship arrived in the daytime the next morning. So everything was very visible. They unloaded the ship with the tanks, the artillery and everything in broad daylight. All the combatants got off. So they contacted the Algerian leadership and said, okay, we're ready. We're ready to go to the front line. We're ready to fight. Cubans are ready to fight. So the Algerian leadership said, okay, hold on, because we think they want to have negotiations about the war to possibly have a peaceful resolution. So the King Hassan, King of Morocco, said, okay, yeah, let's have a talk in Bamako, Mali. So they had a talk about peace, possibly peacefully resolving the resolution. So sure enough, Ben Bella and King Hassan went to Bamako, Mali, and lo and behold, King Hassan said, no problem, we'll retract from your borders, and everything will be peaceful. we won't bother you anymore. And so what this shows is, whenever a bully tries to bully you, if you have backup from the Cubans, you don't have to worry. You know, so they let him go. I love that story. So, yeah, so that was Algeria. And, you know, Morocco left Algeria alone after that, after they saw the Cubans. So there was no fighting, you know, that was the end of it. The Cubans didn't have to fight, and the ship came back, you know. So next example is Che Guevara. His next trip to Africa was in 1964 and 65. He met representatives of some of the most radical and progressive revolutionary anti-colonial countries and movements. And based on his assessment, there were two key countries where he thought Cuba could have some good impact, and that was Congo-Brazzaville and Zaire via Tanzania. Congo-Brazzaville was progressive, and they had MPLA forces in Congo-Brazzaville. As you heard, MPLA is the Angolan Liberation Movement, the left liberation movement. And then in Zaire now, they were battling the reactionary government of Kasavubu and Mobutu at the time, and those were Lumumbas. The Simba forces were Lumumbas, who, you know, Lumumba had been murdered in 1961 by CIA-inspired Belgian and Katangan forces. So after that, people who followed Lumumba's ideology were called the Simba fighters. And so Che and the Cubans thought they were, you know, going to support the Simbas. And Tanzania was a very progressive country in Africa because it hosted many of the liberation movements, and so that was the only way entry into Congo. I mean, now it's called DRC, but at the time it was called Zaire. So Che went to Tanzania, and with a contingent of, he had met with Kabila first, and then went to Tanzania to meet with the combatants there to continue fighting with the Simbas. But the Cubans overestimated the revolutionary potential in Zaire and Congo. In '65, the Revolted Assemblers, the Revolted Assemblers was defeated by CIA mercenaries, including white South Africans and Cuban exiles who were bombing. Okay, at that point, Che with his column of 128 guerrillas, they fought for 7 months. 6 men were killed, 3 were left due to illness. And some key figures there were Che, Victor Drake, who's an African Cuban, and Papi Osmani Cienfuegos was the head of African operations. So I'll skip, since I only have 5 minutes, to go to the next example here, which is Guinea-Bissau. Okay, now Guinea-Bissau, let's see. Yeah, this is one of Africa's smallest countries, and a very important one, though. Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde had a liberation movement that was headed by the organization called the PAIGC, the Party for African Independence of Guinea and Cape Verde. And it began an armed struggle in 1963, and after 2 years, they controlled a third of the country and were challenging 20,000 Portuguese troops. The PAIGC was headquartered in Conakry, Guinea, which was under the leadership of the revolutionary government of the great African Ahmed Sékou Touré. These are 2 African leaders. They were very close ideologically as well. Che had met Cabral in Conakry for the first time in 1965. Cabral requested Cuban arms, which were delivered a couple of months later. A group of Cape Verdeans went to Cuba for training and later joined the PAIGC. In January 1966, Cabral made his first trip to Havana, leading a PAIGC delegation to the Tri-Continental Conference, also known as OSPAL. OSPAL stands for Organization of Solidarity with the Peoples of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. This is very important. Somebody else mentioned the solidarity of Africa, Asia, and at first, before it became Latin America, this goes back to the Bandung Conference when it was just Africa and Asia. Now, Cuba is the one responsible for adding Latin America to it. So we have to thank Cuba as well. This is a political contribution Cuba has made, this important contribution made by Cuba and leadership that Cuba has had in this endeavor. And it was at this non-aligned, at this OSPAL meeting that Cabral delivered his famous speech called The Weapon of Theory. Che Guevara also delivered a famous speech on the focal theory at that same conference. So between 1966 and 1974, 50 Cubans fought on the battlefield in Guinea-Bissau, 9 died, and 1 was captured, and that was Rodriguez Peralta, who served 5 years in a Portuguese prison. He was freed in 1974 when the Portuguese government of Caetano was overthrown. And then in 1977, the Guinea-Bissau government invited him to come to a ceremony in which they awarded him the Amilcar Cabral Medal of Bravery. And at the ceremony, Luis Cabral said, and I quote, "We know that we are able to fight and triumph because other countries and people helped us with weapons, medicine, with supplies. But there is one nation that in addition to material, political, and diplomatic support, even sent its children to fight by our side, to shed their blood in our land, alongside that of the best of our children, of our country. This great people, this heroic people, we all know that is the heroic people of Cuba, the Cuba of Fidel Castro, the Cuba of Sierra Maestra, the Cuba of Moncada. Cuba sent its best sons here to help us in the technical aspects of our war, to help us wage this great struggle against Portuguese colonialism. One of the sons of Cuba who fought and shed his blood in our land is here with us today. Our brother and comrade, Pedro Rodriguez Peralta, who was wounded, captured on November 18, 1969, and spent 5 years in Portugal in the prison of Caixas. On this day, on which we honor our heroes and our martyrs, the government of the Republic of Guinea-Bissau has decided to give our comrade, Comandante Pedro Rodriguez Peralta, the Amilcar Cabral Medal of Bravery. Guinea-Bissau and the PAIGC won the anti-colonial war in 1973 and was eventually recognized by the UN. So the last example is long, and the reality is even longer, which is Angola. Angola, people may not realize, fought a 27-year war, which can be broken down into many stages. I mean, that is so involved and complex, you could have a symposium on just that alone. So I won't go into it too much, but to say that Nelson Mandela, who was, this war, I should say, against the forces, not only of Portugal in the beginning, but South Africa, the United States, and Israel, was a really protracted war against forces of UNITA and FLNA and Mobutu, But there are a couple of things that I just found out about too, doing the research for this, that some of the battles, I mean, everybody knows about the Quito Carnevale battle, which happened between 87 and 88. But in 75, there was some vicious battles too. And that really were the precursors to all of this, because Angola got its independence November 1st, 75. So in 75, you know, Fidel found out that South Africa had sent forces there, and they were encroaching upon the south of Angola, coming into the country. They were going to take Luanda, the capital. So Fidel said, you know, we got to send forces. And he asked the Soviet Union for transportation help. The Soviet Union said no. You know, Cuba said, well, we going anyway. And they, you know, they buy that. And see, a lot of people think, you know, they're stooges of the Soviet Union. At that point for Africa, no. You know, although Angola got help eventually from the Soviet Union as well, but Fidel Castro, you know, he was amazing. He sent the Cuban battalion, and they, in October of 75, you know, they battled the South Africans in a place called Djibo in the south of Luanda. That was, they talk about how they ambushed them, you know. They really snuck them, and the South Africans were so stunned and surprised by it, they retreated for a while until they came back in the 80s, you know. But so that was an amazing war, and that war resulted in the freedom of Namibia, the liberation of Namibia, and the end of apartheid, and Nelson Mandela getting out of prison in 1990. So that was Cuba's most impressive success in Africa, but Cuba has made so many contributions. In closing, I just want to give a little quotation of what Mandela said when he visited Cuba in 1991, expressing his gratitude. He said, "The Cuban people hold a special place in the hearts of the people of Africa. The Cuban internationalists have made a contribution to African independence, freedom, and justice, unparalleled for its principled and selfless character. We admire the sacrifices of the Cuban people in maintaining their independence and sovereignty in the face of a vicious imperialist orchestrated campaign." And Castro called for, he called Angola an African Giron, which is the pigs, you know, remembrance of the Bay of Pigs. So in closing, I just want to go over different categories that Cuba's given assistance to Africa. One is military hardware, also it's a weapon, tanks, artillery, military specialists, operated sophisticated weapons, construction workers who built houses, roads, bridges, medical brigades, including doctors, nurses, physician assistants, medical supplies, and education, full scholarships. I mean, African countries have not had to pay anything for full scholarships of thousands of Africans who came to Cuba and became doctors, engineers, technicians, mechanics, military training. Much of this aid to Africa continues to this day, and especially in the medical area. Cuba's role and leadership in fighting the Ebola virus in Africa is a good example. In Dr. Piero Glichia's book, he documents in his book that in 2002, there were more than 2,000 doctors in 21 different countries in Africa. One last thing I just want to say, in 1990, Kwame Ture went to Cuba, and he said at a conference there, it was a conference about Malcolm X and SNCC, he said he could never be ungrateful to the people of Cuba, nor to Cuba's incarnation, Fidel Castro. In 1967, US imperialism was seriously planning to assassinate me. Still is. I am more determined to destroy it today than I was in 67. In 1967, I was at the level of my lowest organizational strength. It was Fidel Castro who, before the world revolutionaries at the OLAS conference, said, "If imperialism touches one grain of hair on his head, we shall not let the fact pass without retaliation." It was he who, on his own behalf, asked them all to stay in contact with me when I returned to the States to offer protection. This period, as I pointed out, was a critical period in my political life, I would make many errors, but of one thing I am certain: my ability to continue serving the revolution is greatly attributed to just one more act of an infinite number of Fidel Castro's contribution to world humanity. Thank you. Thank you.